don't think I need this, but for those of you who can hear my voice, this is not God, or the voice of God, maybe not even the voice of reason. But if you can hear my voice and you're not sitting in these chairs up here, please feel free to come and join us. We are incredibly fortunate to have Lynda Grose come out from San Francisco to be with us today. She was introduced to me specifically because I've been working towards having greater conversations about sustainability, about circular design, about ways to break down systems and structures that exist that have sort of plagued our ability to really dig into why we do the things we do, sort of philosophically, ontologically, all those different constructs. And so we had a number of conversations, and we really, from my perspective, I immediately was thinking, when I grow up, I hope I could be half as smart as Lynda because of all of her experiences, which she will go into. She will be sharing and talking today about a lot of those experiences. But one of the things that I really hope that we walk away with is if you just kind of turn around and look, what she and I think will align with is that this is a topic and this is a subject matter that is truly important, but it's one that people don't want to hear because it will require change. It will require the need to alter our behaviors, to be less complacent, right? And so this is not unusual, but both Lynda and I know that this is still a message that has to be sent. We still have to be sharing these things. And we're fortunate because it's being recorded. And so for future prosperity, that will certainly be an option for people to review later. And that's a good thing, right? But I am very fortunate because Lynda is a design educator. She's an author. She's working in sustainable fashion for 30 years, which we will learn a lot about. We've been talking about Yvonne Chenard, and she's got some close connections to that whole movement and the idea of organic cottons and the uses of them, which she will go into a lot of detail with as well. She's been working with farmers as well as artisans and artists. So she's got this really incredibly well-rounded background. And so without further ado, we just thank you so much, Lynda, for being here. And I'm really looking forward to learning from you today.
Thank you, Jason, and also thank you for inviting me here. I've really enjoyed the sessions this morning and really quite impressed with the sincerity and really the actions that are going on actually in Colorado. I wanted to get a sense of the audience first. Who's an entrepreneur here? Raise your hand. Okay, great. Who's an investor? Any investors? Everybody's looking around to see if they're awesome. Oh, okay, great. Designers? Any designers? Fabulous. Anthropologists? No? Biologists? Ah, okay, great. So the reason I asked that is, first of all, rule number one, know your audience. But, we're in climate crisis. It's a hugely complex problem, and it takes all of our combined experience, perspectives, knowledge, tools to really grapple with those complexities. So the more diverse we are, the more perspectives we have, the better equipped we are. I'm a mainstream designer myself. I came to sustainability whilst working in a large corporation. And so I have that particular perspective. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And I'll be today, this is going to be part storytelling and part direct experience and observation and wayfinding, sort of responding to the results of the work that you're doing as you're trying to figure out being a designer in this time and trying to always reposition yourself where you're being effective. And so it's my journey, but everyone in this room has a journey and a background to contribute to this movement, and I'm really interested in your perspectives at the end. So before I launch in, I just want everybody to think about a garment that they've kept for a long time. hold that thought, and then think about why you've kept it for a long time. A garment, an article of clothing, yeah. Maybe you associate it with a time in your life or a rite of passage. Maybe it reminds you of someone in particular. And then just hold that. It might come up again later. But what I want people to understand and realize is that fashion is so much more than supply chains and shopping. And yet this material culture is often missed in our conversations about sustainability, and it's often dismissed and ridiculed by activists. And as a designer, that material culture, that's where we can really play an important part in contributing to this movement. So with that, you've probably noticed I've got a bit of a funny accent. Sorry if it's difficult to understand. It's from the north of England, from a mill town called Bury that's part of Greater Manchester. It's where cotton was first industrialized. And when I was 7 years old, we moved from that industrial area where 3-4 generations, as much as I can trace back, lived and were born in Bury. My mum and I moved to a seaside town on the Irish Sea, overlooking looking out towards the Isle of Man. And we moved in with my great-uncle Ted in a one-bedroom row house until we were assigned a council flat. So it's like public housing. But I thought we were really posh living in Fleetwood, where I could play on the sands instead of on the streets or down a back alley. And Fleetwood, just so that you know, is where everybody who works in those factories in that mill town still actually goes to Fleetwood on their holidays for the 2 weeks holiday that they have a year. So boy, we were posh. And I ran off and with my bucket and spade immediately left my mum and great-uncle Ted to unpack the moving van. So I grew up with a single mom, and as such, or in England at that time, we got free school meals. So sort of like a food stamp kind of thing for working class kids. And we also got a free school uniform. And at the beginning of the semester, we would get a voucher to buy school uniforms from a particular designated shop. And school uniforms are a great leveler. Everybody in England in public school wears a school uniform. But shoes are much more problematic. We used to get vouchers for shoes from a place called Timpson's. And there was no way in hell I was going to wear these shoes from Timpson's. They were granny shoes. I didn't care if they were free, you know. So fashion in working class England plays a really important role, because relatively inexpensively, you can dress up and be somebody. And through fashion, humans send out messages about who they are, all products actually, about who they are, but most importantly, who they are not. So these are very powerful areas. Later, as a teenager, I would step off that council estate wearing culottes and platform shoes. Things come around again. And I'd go to another larger seaside resort called Blackpool. You might have heard of it. Nodding heads, that's great. Where I could go to nightclubs and dance to Northern Soul and be somebody else. Okay. Now, this will become relevant later as pull you into the design world and so on. So I was the first in my family to go to college. I graduated from Kingston University with a BA Honours in fashion, and shortly thereafter moved to New York to work in the fashion industry there. And weekends away and holidays were spent upstate in a place called Lake George. Anybody know Lake George? Yeah, great. Well, this was amazing to me. It's the first time I'd come across vacation houses. Wow, with big wraparound porches, no TV, lots of books, and ice boats that were dusted off in the winter to play on. Everything seemed so much bigger in America, even life itself. But it wasn't until I was recruited by Esprit to be a designer at their headquarters in San Francisco that I really came to understand the big Western states, big nature out here. And a group of expatriate designers, we didn't have anywhere to go one Thanksgiving, and so we took off across 3 states to see the Grand Canyon and really experience, it really felt like a moonscape to us. Our eyes and ears were really straining for something familiar. Life-changing for all of us, actually. But so it was then that by the time Esprit, where I was working, brought in activists and environmentalists to educate their employees across the company about ecological issues, that I had some experience and backdrop about big nature to understand the messages they were communicating. So there were people like Dave Foreman, who found Earth First, David Brower, talking about preserving wilderness. I really got that. Paul Ehrlich talking about increased wealth and population on a collision course with declining resources. Mark Reisner, who wrote Cadillac Desert, talking about the fragile infrastructure of water in California, which I know is very prescient also here in Colorado. And, it was kind of difficult to understand what these issues at that time, so this is the early 90s, what they had to do with getting a spec sheet out to Hong Kong by the end of the day. But we also had an eco-audit company-wide that was employee-led, and we were looking at energy and water use, plastic hangers, things like that. And as a young designer, I and a few other colleagues started looking at the product itself. I'm going to go into that a little bit. But I said, in terms of not quite understanding the relevance of this information, other things that were really difficult to understand had already been processed by our co-founder, Doug Tompkins, who placed this ad in 1990 into the Utne Reader, and it was a plea for responsible consumption, asking people, our customers, only to buy what they needed, and that we would adjust the company volume or the size of the company down or up accordingly. And we thought it was absolutely nuts at the time. But the eco-audit was going forward, discoveries were being made, and we actually, the research became known as a line of clothing called e-collection. In the early days, we actually called it research and discovery because we were making discoveries. Like, for example, I had no idea whatsoever that electroplated hardware, our metal snaps and buttons that we had, created toxic sludge that had to be specially landfilled. And so we found non-rusting alloys instead, and we brought those to market. We were only, at the time, discovering that cotton was even grown in California, and through Pesticide Action Network, understanding the toxicity of cotton growing at that time, and then we brought organic cotton to market. So we were finding the impacts, and we were bringing viable alternatives, direct responses to market. So I'm not going to go into the other details. At the time, they were innovative. Now they're well-known, things like Tencel, recycled wool, low-impact dyes. But the points I want to leave you with is that there was always a creative solution to a technical problem. Because of the relationship between the owners, Doug Tompkins and Yvonne Chenard, they were very close climbing buddies. We shared information back and forth. We were required, actually, to share information back and forth by the owners. Because Esprit was a global fashion company that was $1 billion company at that time, we helped to popularize an approach to fashion and sustainability that was about reducing ecological impacts. And that was a concept for its time, and I would say it's out of step now with the times now. It's no longer relevant. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later. So I first became aware of that vast San Joaquin Valley, the agricultural region of California, through an organization called the Sustainable Cotton Project. It's a non-profit organization working with farmers, conventional farmers, to help them transition to biological and organic practices. And in those early days of discovering cotton and the issues, we went on a farm tour to meet with farmers and scientists and understand how difficult it was to shift in an industrial system like that. And then when I left Esprit, I worked as a consultant with the Sustainable Cotton Project to help them communicate and explain what organic cotton was to the industry at that time. There was a lot of skepticism at that time. We're well known for these farm tours. We still run them, bringing students, members of the public, members of industry, activists into the fields to meet with farmers and scientists to understand those difficulties and work together for change. We're running one in late October this year. If anybody's interested in joining it and you want to come to California, talk to me later. One of my jobs as well was to communicate that complex information into highly visual language so it could be understood easily and then actionable by the companies. And one of the bits of information that we're well known for is this: 1/3 of a pound of chemicals and fertilizers and pesticides for every t-shirt made. So I want to emphasize this was scientifically derived in the late 90s, looking at the US National Agricultural Statistics, and then working with brands and spinners to estimate how many pounds of fiber went into a t-shirt, and that's how we ended up with this. It was specific to the US and US cotton growing states. And it was really helpful to work this way because in our meetings with companies, we could sit down and have strategic conversations. If a company could understand that if they had 1 million t-shirts, then they were responsible for 1/3 of 1 million pounds of chemicals, and then start to strategically figure through a US organic program to offset that chemical use. And that maybe that commitment would be spread across certain businesses, a certain percentage to women who might be more aware, a little bit more to their kids' business because mothers buy the kids' clothes, maybe less to men because they're later to shift. Excuse the men in the audience, but this is the way, these are the conversations that are within the companies. So the conversations were very precise about what the issues were, but open-ended, opening up possibilities. So I said this was scientifically derived, but it was unscientifically applied by activists and by companies who applied that term or meme. It became a meme in the industry, and it was applied to any cotton grown anywhere across the globe, whether it was a chemical-intensive system or not. And that was the first indication to me of a messaging of a company, the front-end messaging being disconnected from back-end real change. So in the late 1990s, you see that peak there in 1999, the effects of the North American Free Trade Agreement were really being felt in the US textile industry, particularly in the Carolinas, but across the US. And China joining the World Trade Organization had its impacts as well. And sourcing, as we all know, moved overseas where the labor was cheaper, the sourcing of textiles, the development of garments. And the sourcing of organic cotton also moved overseas. You see that big plummet after 1999. And it recovered a little bit, but frankly, given the number of brands who are now involved in organic cotton, it's never really fully recovered. But the point that I want to make here is that when companies moved overseas to source organic cotton, they moved because of price. They did not move overseas because of an identified ecological issue. And they moved to places that actually didn't use chemicals, like, for example, Turkey at the time, where water and labor might be the issue, but not toxicity. And that was an indication of a time when brands stopped asking precise questions and responding appropriately. Rather, they sought out organic as an end goal, as a label. It was no longer a tool for change. It was a label. I remember having a conversation with the founding executive director of the Organic Exchange. It's now called the Textile Exchange. It's an industry organization where companies who are looking at ecological issues share information through, it's like a trade organization. And she said to me, Lynda, people don't want to know why organic cotton anymore. They want to know how to bring it to market. So in our rush to increase the market for sustainable fashion, conversations shifted from being precise and open-ended to being muted and closed. Meantime, though, back in the fields with the Sustainable Cotton Project farmers, does anybody know any farmers? Conventional farmers tend to be very conservative, not very liberal at all, especially in California Valley, Central California. Lots of anti-Newsom and pro-Trump posters and so on and so forth. But they were finding beneficial insects in their fields that they never knew they had. Normally, a conventional farmer would spray for insects, verbatim, not realizing that there were some good bugs in the field that would eat the bad bugs if you hold off on spraying, and there'd be a natural balance within the natural systems in the field. And so this was a sign that the Sustainable Cotton Project's learnings and teachings, trainings, the support of the farmers were working. And there were farmers also, like John Texera here, who were planting hedgerows to invite pollinators and wildlife back into the field. And it was shifting the aesthetics of the landscape, that vast agricultural landscape. Even the scientists were talking about the aesthetics. Let me just go back now a second. I just want to make sure that I make a point here. Because it was here where then I understood that organic, recycled, low impact, that wasn't what sustainability was. That all of those were tools for changing the culture in the field. So here you had conventional farmers who were being reconnected to nature. They were changing their habits in the field. They were becoming, re-engaging with insects in the field. And that the fashion industry was measuring what it could measure, the increased number of organic units sold, and the measures of success for the Sustainable Cotton Project were very different. So going down to the Central Valley every year, sometimes several times a year, to run these farm tours, I've witnessed firsthand how our emphasis on productivity and efficiency shapes the natural landscape. These farmers have had access to the best available technologies for decades, equipment to apply chemicals by land and by air, genetic modification since it was first commercialized in 1996. Even the land, the fields are laser leveled to enable water to run efficiently from one end of the field to the other. And these combined technologies have enabled this region to become the most productive on the planet in terms of cotton production. The farmers will often get to 5 or 6 bales an acre, 3,000 pounds. Just to give you an idea, it's about 3 to 4 times the global average of cotton yielded. It's an enormous, incredible feat of human engineering and innovation. And yet, if you look at the local regions, the local areas, there's extreme poverty. It's known as Forgotten California, around Fresno, around that, Central California. There's 33% poverty rate in Fireball, where the program is centered at $37,000 per annum, which in California is, not a lot, as you know. 21% unemployment. And so the point here is that innovation in and of itself is not enough. We must ask, who do we want to benefit from all of this productivity and this innovation? A little bit like the last panel brought up. And not just be disruptive and be focused on innovation just for its own sake. What are the results that we want? What are the outcomes? So I was on the board of Goodwill Bay Area for 8 years, and often brought my students, I continue to bring my students into their warehouses where after garments have been on the shop floor and not sold, the products go into the back and they go into what's called aftermarket. They get baled up again and sold to people that might use them in flea markets, or they go overseas. And it can be, perhaps you already know this, the average citizen throws away about 68 pounds of clothing a year, which is about 34 pairs of jeans, just so that you know. And that's an average, so someone somewhere is throwing away a lot more. So witnessing that massive mobilization of natural resources out of the cotton field for lint, processed through the fashion system, and then disposed of at this end, you just can't help question our fetish with yielding more, growing more, even designing more, producing more, to what end, right? So by the time Patagonia's ad came out, that's very famous, "Don't buy this jacket," in 2011, it sent ripples through the business community, ripples through the fashion industry. It wasn't that much of a shock to me. The sentiments, the language were sort of echoes of Doug's ad back in the 1990s in the Utne Reader. And of course, it was very clever advertising, because when you say "don't buy this jacket" on the particular Friday, that's the biggest shopping day of the year, it simultaneously, of course, says "do buy this brand." And that is exactly what happened. Probably everybody knows that this jacket sold more goods than ever. So I'm making a point of this particular ad because in education, in design, in business, in research, environmental areas even, communities, we hold this up as a gold standard, and the company, for that matter, up as a gold standard. And when we do that, without critically questioning, was this the real intention of the ad or not? What was the desired outcome? And when we do that, we limit ourselves to one company within one sector of the economy, when we need many companies and many more across all sectors of the economy, and new ones yet to be developed to really tackle this climate issue, this climate crisis that we're in. We close down possibilities and our collective intelligence, ecological intelligence. And I want to drill down on this a little bit more, because when something ends up selling more, when it's good for business, when sustainability is good for business, it's a real issue. And Patagonia's, it discloses these complexities that emerge. In their B Corporation report from 1919, they said that they were making real progress towards being a carbon neutral company. But even as they were making significant advances, the footprint was increasing due to the growth in sales. That's the biggest hurdle to sustainability and carbon drawdown, is growth in sales. I want to drill down on this just a little bit. We have a business audience, so this is probably quite easy to understand. But say you're a $400 million company in 1990, and you become a $1 billion company, say, in 2020. And say that 25% of your product is recycled, or 25% of your product is organic. That means that 75% isn't. And over time, in a growth business model, that 75% grows exponentially greater than the sustainable part of your business. So this is the growth dynamic put into a diagram. And this is what we've been doing for the past 30 years. We've been reporting in on the 25%, our indices that we've developed to guide us in this process that's what we measure. And we haven't been measuring the difference between what we're doing and not doing, and what the overall company achievements have been, what the net outcome has been. And we've been losing ground over the last 30 years. So Garam Gvasalia is very well-loved Georgian designer in my field, in fashion design. He was a co-founder of the designer brand Vetements. And in a Financial Times interview in 2017, he called out all companies who claim to be sustainable for producing way more product than anyone could possibly buy. He essentially changed that conversation about, really a 20-year conversation about conspicuous consumption, into one about conspicuous production. He essentially changed the ad, "Don't buy this jacket," into "Don't produce this jacket." And so this has come up, actually. I was quite surprised, a little bit nervous about talking to a business audience about this being the imperative, although it's come up several times in previous panels today. But it's really hard to sit with, isn't it? Even now, even last night's conversation over dinner, there was a tense moment. It's a really hard thing to grapple with. Oh, it's all very well, Lynda, nice presentation, but in the real world, So I'd like us to brainstorm a little bit about this when we, at the end of the presentation, especially with an entrepreneurial and business audience. And what I really want to say is that sustainability has been now fully appropriated and subjugated by the mainstream consumer culture, and that even the best of us don't seem to be able to wrest ourselves or our businesses from its hard-nosed grip on this real world. So then, you move into inspiration. If you can't, if you're trying all these different places to go, and, where do you go next? And you've got to keep positive, right? And I'm a firm believer that, you bring these dark sides of our industry to the surface because they're the next point of innovation. You have to bring them to the surface. Otherwise, what are we doing? What's the intended outcome? And I found Arturo Escobar and his designs for the Pluriverse really inspiring, and so did Jason. It was one of our bonding moments, and in his book, he calls this mainstream consumer culture the one world world. Again, if you're not into this increased growth imperative, it's completely unquestioned, and if it is questioned, those ideas are edited out as not being realistic. Again, nice idea, but in the real world. And he encourages us to break away from the mainstream culture so that other ideas, other values can come to the surface fully in an organic fashion, and other ways of being, other different languages can come to the surface so that people can recognize the difference. He calls them dissenting imaginations, territories of difference, so that ways other can come to the surface. So one dissenting imagination project comes from my co-author, Kate Fletcher, who's based in England, and she did a 5-year research project called Local Wisdom, engaging everyday members of the public, asking them about their clothes and their relationship with their clothes. And I'm going to share some of these things with you. Maybe you'll recognize some of your own feelings about your clothes from that earlier question. This young woman, for example, came to the photographic session with this garment that she'd bought in a thrift store, and it needed to fit a little bit better through the waist. So she turned it inside out to do some alterations, and she found that it had been hand-sewed already. And that, to her, was less intimidating than going into a ready-finished, highly refined product. She felt comfortable going in and putting a zipper in there, and it fits her perfectly. She loves it. She feels great in it. But that's an indicator. That's good feedback for us as designers to design things not so static, meant for just being worn the way that it is, to make them accessible so that everyday people can tinker with it and make it their own. And this guy, I love this guy, he picked up this garment. There's a lot of conversation about fast fashion, and those binary conversations, again, where we lambast fast fashion. But this guy picked up a garment from J. Crew in the late 80s when he first went to New York, so it was associated with this time for him. And he'd kept it all these years, and still his favorite sweater, and he wore it twice a day. And he stopped in the middle of the conversation and he said, J. Crew's not an ethical company, but I guess I've forced them into being one. So perspectives, can be very different. There's a very complicated, when you talk with a company about shifting a fast fashion business, it gets very complicated very fast. And in a different part in the supply chain or in the world of fashion, perspectives can be very different and very easy. And it's important to have all the voices at the table. So now, cotton, just back to cotton, with some of my own experimental ideas that I'm bringing forward with colleagues in Australia and London and Denmark. And it's called Research Through Practice, where you get a hunch, an informed hunch about an idea, and then you test it out in the studio, you iterate. So these are some ideas that we have around cotton, given that we have clothing, that we have a climate crisis, that disrupted weather patterns are really disrupting also the yields of cotton globally through droughts and floods, like Pakistan's recent floods, for example. And so we are now in a cotton-constrained world. So how might we take care of the cotton that we've already got in use, that's already in circulation? So one thing that I've been working on is with something called cationic cotton. And it's been around in the industry for several decades. It's usually used in the supply chain. It has a positive charge so that it takes up dye stuff more readily and darker than conventional cotton. And it's usually used in T-shirts to create tonal stripes in 100% cationic, 100% conventional, and then blends. And they're set up in gray goods, and then they can be garment dyed in whatever color. And it really saves on yarn dye inventory waste. But what if we used it at the wearer end to embed invisible patterns into garments, into knitted garments, so that the wearer buys a garment and it looks one way, and later in the product's life, when the wearer needs refreshment, when the garment needs to be refreshed, it can be overdyed to activate those patterns, distracting the eye in a completely different direction, perhaps creating a sense of delight and satisfying desire in ways other than shopping for new items. And what if white shirts were designed to be easily disassembled, to be digitally printed? These experiments, we ran them through a digital printer, and it did work, and there were some glitches you can see up the front of the garment. And glitches always give you good feedback. That was an indicator that if we were to design things to go through a digital printer, we would use different constructions up the front placket of the garment. So it's reinforming design, and it's reinforming what we teach as design educators also. And what if prints were designed to be temporal, so that they became darker over time? When a garment came back the first time, the second time, that those prints became darker and darker, indicating that the garment had been in use for longer, that we were taking care of our garments, the fiber, the planet, ourselves. So what we found through this particular experimentation was that we didn't have to disassemble the total garment at all. We only had to disassemble parts of it where there were curves and where there were pleats, so it could lie flat. So now we're looking at what are the elements, what are the design principles of designing for a garment to lie flat, so it can receive printing over a second, third, fourth life. And different pattern structures are emerging, a different pattern language for cutting out the pattern are emerging as a result. So the old patterning, which frankly comes from the Victorian economy, which emphasized productivity and efficiency, those are starting to melt away, and new patterning, new ways of constructing garments are starting to emerge that are relevant for a 21st century economy that's based on conservation, adaptability. We're challenging good quality construction, French seams, for example, that you have on the inside of your jeans or down the side seam of a shirt. it's even a colonial name, French seams, are being challenged. New languages are emerging, right? And other people are working on this. There's reverse supply chain logistics going on because people are also understanding the importance of just working and designing differently. New sewing thread that dissolves with heat is something that we're testing now also. So I just want to acknowledge that these ideas are a bit scrappy and they need to be developed, they need to be tested. We're interviewing company owners and getting their input on the ideas. It tends to be companies who have been involved in the service industry rather than in relying on increased throughput. And we're testing them on wearers. But over time, these scrappy ideas, just like skateboards and cell phones, they get critiqued, they get refined, and they get built upon, and eventually accepted by and even change culture. And that's what we're aiming to do by including designers and wearers in these conversations.
Backdrop of my shirt, I can alter through designs of the LED lights the foreground of my shirt.
Right.
I have one t-shirt, tomorrow it's purple, the day after it's yellow, and I don't have to throw it away or say it doesn't match my pants. In addition to which, depending on the frequencies and amounts of energy passed through the electrical threads, I can make that shirt warmer when it gets colder. So in essence, I'm not buying and throwing away clothes, even though that shirt may have cost me more. In addition, I can also have a Black Panther costume with, I put something thicker than the electric threads. I put the electric wires with LED wiring on my, let's say, shirt or jacket, and then I can look like the Black Panther without necessarily buying the exquisite design myself. So I feel that the multifunctional design is going to take over the future of us having a lot of clothes and creating a lot of pollution and throwing all the garbage out.
Fabulous. Hold that thought, because we do want to have these conversations. And if I can just come to the end.
Sorry.
That's okay. If I could just come to the end, because it would be great if lots of people contribute ideas, because there are lots of innovation ideas once we let go of stuffy growthism that has got us constrained. So if I can just drive to the end, and I particularly want to get to Jason's favorite project, and I don't want to clip him out. So bear with me just for a few more minutes. So what I want to emphasize here is that Arturo Escobar goes to pains to note that these ideas, these territories of difference, one of which was just mentioned, don't do away with commerce or capitalism at all. Rather, they displace it and certainly reduce its full grip and power in our lives. But it's still there. People often hear that it actually is anti-capitalist, but it's still there. And there are just other territories that come into play so that these other ideas can flourish organically. The founder of Whole Earth Catalog, Stuart Brand, and Along Now, and many other initiatives, talks in particular, so hang on a second, I just got off cue, sorry. So new languages also emerge. So the language, for example, of scalability, bringing things to scale, is something that I notice in this particular, in the startup culture, and certainly in the fashion industry, bringing things to scale. But it presupposes the conditions of the old industrial ecology. And Stuart Brand, who's well regarded in industrial design circles and design in general, he says, it's not scale that changes things, it's ideas. You bring people together to tinker, you bring things to life, and then you work with the life. And that is what we're trying to do here, is bring ideas and the vision of this post-growth culture to life. So one of the ideas that has come up recently for me in navigating this territory and coming from industry into education, and into academia where you're testing things and then back into industry again, is I was sitting in sometimes you have an itch and you just have to scratch it. And I was sitting in this wealthy suburb in Northern California in a coffee shop, and I was surrounded by these fancy logos. And I just had this urge to flash a Goodwill logo. I just wanted to sort of disrupt that hierarchy. Thank you for laughing at that. So you get it. I just like, and then it was on the back burner for a little while, as those ideas are. And then last year, I attended the conference, the Textile Exchange Conference, that was in Ireland, and I beamed in remotely to watch Jason Hickel, who's a hero, who's a degrowth proponent. He's an anthropologist and an economist. And he did a really rousing keynote speech. It was really great. And then there seemed to be a very sincere effort over the next 6 days or so for the Sustainable Apparel Coalition and Textile Exchange to really fold this into initiatives that they already had going. And then on the last day of the conference, the CEO of Primark, which is an Irish fast fashion brand, took to the stage and said, "I make no apologies for being a big volume retailer. We bring sustainable fashion to our customers at a price that they can afford." And it was like a lead weight. I mean, the message was, I have the power and the system's not going to change. It was a real reality check. And of course, he can say that he brings sustainable fashion to customers at a price they can afford because of that approach to fashion and sustainability, the incremental approach. It's something that they can do, right? And it's a really good critique of fashion and sustainability. It's not very accessible. It tends to be expensive. It's not very diverse. It can even be very self-righteous. But he's also talking about my people. I've got family members who buy Primark, and this really did not sit well with me at all, that a company can have such a hold on the basic human instinct or need to better oneself, to dress up and be somebody. And so the Goodwill Label Stories project is an idea, and it takes Goodwill labels that had made, woven labels, and suggests that people out themselves from their secondhand purchases. Normally, it's an invisible thing that you do. No one really knows if something is secondhand or not. There's a lot, of course, stigma associated with secondhand, even though it's cheaper than fast fashion, and often you get garments that are better made than fast fashion garments. But like those Timson shoes, there's a bit of a stigma, certainly at lower end demographics, or certainly I thought, anyway. And what I do is I sit in the store with a sewing machine and needles and threads, and when people make a purchase at the cash register, I invite them to give their opinion on this idea of labeling garments and simply say to them, what do you think of the idea? And would you do it? Yes or no? And if so, why and why not? I'm using the label really as a social probe to get information or to have conversations with people, a little bit like StoryCorps. So the goal of the project is to popularize more secondhand purchases, because all of those goods that go through the garments, as you saw before, they can't possibly be sold in the store, and they do go to waste. So as much as we can increase the uptake of secondhand purchases, great. Also, to unfreeze that stigma, and then really bring diverse voices into the conversation as a counterbalance to the power of the narratives coming from the brands. And so here are some images from California sessions, Northern and Southern California. Fabulous, diverse people. And I'm just going to share some of the insights so far that have been gained. And this is the first time that it's been shared in a public environment like this. But you hear a lot in the fashion industry that the customers are not educated about sustainability. And I'm finding that these people are very educated about the big picture. One woman who was a nurse said, "There's so much already, why do we need more?" So they're very aware of this big picture problem. It's a sign that we know about the problem and we're doing something about it. So we know about this problem of overproduction and waste, and the label indicates that we're taking action. So I'm finding them to be very aware about these issues. They might not be the issues that companies who are dependent on selling more stuff want them to be aware of, but they're definitely very aware. This woman said, "Oh, it's a sign that the garment survived that long process of being produced and then distributed and on its way to being wasteful or wasted, and someone grabbed it. You know, it survived that whole process." This was the first guy, I was really surprised, who said, "I want a label on the garments." He came up and he said, "Is this a promotion?" And I said, "Well, no, it's a research project, it's an art project, really." I really wanted to emphasize that. And he said, "I love Goodwill." And I said, "Oh, why do you love Goodwill?" He said, "Because they hire people." He was very aware that it was a social enterprise, that the profits go back into helping their participants to gainful employment, people that have had hurdles to employment for many years, including former felons. And he was very aware. He said, "I love Goodwill. I want to publicize it." And he got his T-shirt and he was like, "I love it." And I was fantastic. This is great. I'm just going to flick quickly through some garments here. It's a sign of taking care of the community. Again, very aware of the social aspects of Goodwill, not just the recycling, which I was actually surprised by. Love this guy's face, so happy. This was a couple, a son and his mother. They were speaking in Arabic, beautiful language. And he said, "Of course we like it." And I said, "Well, what do you mean, of course?" Because not everybody, there were some voices that didn't like the idea. And I said, "So why?" And he said, "We need to be open and friendly and kind." And that's what the label says. I found this one emotional. If you think, what labels normally do and what it does to the relationship that we have with each other versus what this person was getting from this label. Love that guy. LA, can you tell? And then this woman, from my perspective and the purpose of the project and changing culture, she didn't have a garment label, but she said, "Ooh, this is a really good idea, but I wouldn't label my garment, and I guess that says something about me that's not good." And I said, "No, there's no judgments here at all. I'm really just collecting these stories." And she said, "I understand that, but it's a really interesting project, thank you." And she lingered for a long time. Even though she didn't get a label, she was watching other people. Now she's going to, all of us exist and we operate and participate in invisible norms. And what happened with this woman, this project, this idea has shone a light on her participation in this norm. And she's thinking about it. She's going to go home, process it herself and with her friends and family. And there's a shift. And that's what we're aiming to do with the project. It was a very successful research day when that lady stopped by. So I'm just drawing to a close here, just to say that brilliant ideas can come from anywhere, from any sector of the economy, from everyday people. We need all of them. All of them need to be at the table. All of these voices need to be at the table, diverse voices. This one in particular, from a gentleman who said, oh, it's a public label. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, when items are donated, they become public. Well, that's a pretty good idea for policy. That if companies don't take responsibility for garments they put out into the world at the end of their life, and they become a public burden, maybe the public should own those garments. And this, just finally, this gentleman said, this is brave. It's what we are. I said, what is brave, the idea or the label, and having your garment label? And he said, both. He said, it's what we are and what we do, not we have in the world. So different way of being with each other. I'm just going to land on this one because what I've found is that there is a stigma about secondhand. It's not as much as I thought it would be, and it's across all demographics. So there are people at the higher demographics who don't want their friends to see them in a secondhand store. So that's how perverse, this culture of the new, it's hindering us doing one of the most sustainable things we can possibly do is keeping the materials already extracted in use for longer. And there's a pride, actually, in being working class. We're everyday people, and we shop here, and we love shopping here, one guy said. And then, of course, at the hipster level, it's I'm more working class than you. So I think there's actually a great opportunity in getting these diverse voices. And I'll just leave us with those beautiful faces, and just to say again that when we talk about conspicuous consumption, we're scapegoating consumers, and we take the heat off where the real problem is, which is overproduction. And consumers then become the problem, right? They become the instrument that pulls materials through the system, and therefore they're seen as a burden by activists. Whereas in a project like this, and hopefully many more projects yet to be imagined, everyday people become participants, co-creators, contributors to these ideas for a post-growth economy. And I will just leave us with that. Have many voices rather than this dominant business voice. So there are lots of ideas once we let go of the stuffy constraints of growthism. So that's the message.
Brilliant. Hello, hello. Excellent.
Oh, thank you.
I second that. Right.
Thank you.
That's what I was prefacing when we first started to talk is we're very fortunate to have Lynda here. So, and I do hope that each of you were able to really distill and take some of this information and be pragmatic about it, not just be inspired, but to literally say, this is startup week. So what am I gonna do in the context of starting up something that is going to allow me to dig deeper, have greater conversations, go deep psychologically, and create opportunities, that weren't there before, which is actually a great differentiator. So, but I do want to open up for questions. I don't know if there's an extra microphone in addition to this, but for the ones in the front, I'll share mine. And the gentleman who had the statement earlier, the provocateur, thank you. I love provoking comments. That was brilliant, but I wished he was here to talk more about it. So anyway, thank you.
Yay. Hi.
Thank you. It's always good to have someone in the first row clapping. That's great.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all should have given her a standing ovation because amazing, right? For the Goodwill Project and putting on labels, is that still going on? Is that something we can implement ourselves, but maybe something that also includes local thrift stores and also yard sales? Because that's where majority of my clothes come from. And I don't know if I can put yard sale. That's a big label.
Yeah. So there's nothing stopping you, labeling secondhand garments at all. This is just a random idea, an impulse. Specific to Goodwill, So we've run projects in Northern and Southern California. I really want to go to other states, and I particularly want to go to Rust Belt states, actually. It could be Denver. Thank you for the invite. Absolutely.
Let's talk.
Okay. So yeah, yes, we can do that. It's not something that, I use the label as a social probe. You know, it is a label or a logo that belongs to Goodwill. And so in terms of just giving them out, you know, I think that, you know, that I wouldn't be able to do that. But
I have a podcast called Shit You Don't Want to Talk About to start changing these. Okay. Hi. Hi again. I have a podcast that is about changing these stigmas called Shit You Don't Want to Talk About. And a lot of that has to do with this is a huge thing that so many of us don't talk about, or as you spoke about that, like Primark, when they were talking about, well, it's available at like different price points. That's true, but it's also something that's not going to keep our environment available for long term. So how do we start changing those conversations? And that's why I ask about it, because even if it's a label like Goodwill, it's something that will start conversations. When I wear my shirt that says shit you don't want to talk about, it starts a lot of conversations. And so how do we actually start having them from this subtle changes that we can make?
exactly.
So
Yeah.
that's some shit to talk about.
Yeah.
That's social media, Amanda. Everybody wants to.
Next up, thank you so much for your time. What did Goodwill think about this research project, and how do we in the community support this? Because it's a great idea. I actually work with an entrepreneur. She upcycles clothes. So for her, it's not about stigma, it's about just providing, you know, sustainable clothes in the community at a fair price versus it going in the trash.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think it was a bit of a sleeper, to be honest. You know, and part of it was me having an idea and wanting to test it out, so I did a slow launch in Northern California. They obviously trusted me because they gave me permission to have labels made from the logo. And part of that was because I used to be on the board, so I know the CEO in the Bay Area, so I got that permission. And then we got some publicity, and, you know, then the lawyer said, whoa, do we need to be careful about this? It's going on these other garments with other labels on and so on and so forth. So everything is passed by the lawyer now at this point. The beauty of this, and, you know, something just to share to everybody who's in a particular sector, you know, going from private sector to nonprofit sector, you know, and straddling these areas and design an art project. And the beauty of this is it really is an art project, and it's after purchase that we offer this label to go on the garment. So it's actually, it's the person's decision to put a label on their garments, right? It's their decision. And it's not anything to do, I mean, you know, it's not anything to do with Goodwill, except it's a Goodwill label, if you see what I mean. It's not for promotion, it really is for research. And so it's called fair use, is what I'm doing. There's a big smile over there. Someone's like crafty sort of look on his face. But, you know, I was just like very thoughtful about it. And so that, you know, they're quite happy. They're quite so far about it, and they're willing for it to come into different states. So really pleased about that. Yeah.
Hi there. Thank you so much for this presentation. It brought a light to kind of the area where me and my partner want to grow. So hypothetically, if someone were entering the fashion world with lifestyle brand clothing, what advice would you have for us in terms of embarking on the first steps of creating a sustainable company? For us right now, we're doing printing on demand, but I'm not too happy with the quality and the cuts, but also I know it's not as sustainable as I want it.
Right. So what I say with my students when they're completely overwhelmed with the complexities and how bad things are, and yet they love fashion and they want to do fashion, is I talk about having an arc of practice and say it's unsustainable on this side and sustainable on this side, or, or it's a for-profit business here and a non-profit business over there. That wherever you are on that arc of practice, if you feel like you're being useful and you're moving things forward, that it's the right place to be. And if you know why you're on that arc of practice as well, like I really want to be over here, but I'm over here for now, but I'm working on this. I've got to a point where I feel like we need to be producing less. So it's difficult for me to respond to that question. When we did e-collection, I really got to the point where at that time we're saying, well, we're raising awareness. And so that's how we justify. Do people really need another line of clothing? No, given Doug's ad. But we're raising awareness. Now awareness is really, it's been arisen, I mean, it's definitely much greater than it was that many years ago. So maybe in your business, maybe you start tackling these post-growth ideas. Are there ways in the design of your garments that people can go in and tinker and change things themselves? Will you offer repairs? Let me think. How about having a particular charter that says, this is what we're going to do, and we're not going to choose to do that? So just as an example, Everlane decided they were not going to have any more virgin polyester in their garments, and everything that's 100% recycled. That's one company making that decision. So they're, helping to grow that recycled industry or create a market for it. They're still new products, but there's certain commitments you make that go beyond, what people are doing.
I'd like to add to that real quick. Marty Neumeier was really instrumental in getting Apple on the map in terms of just branding and messaging and all that storytelling. He has a book called Zag, which might be worth reading. But to me, what I'm, as a person who tries to put pieces of a puzzle together, what this presentation is about and what I think you're looking for is you're in a space right now where you have the opportunity to zag when everyone's zigging, right? Everyone's kind of thinking in a certain way, but this content and information that has been provided now is affording you the opportunity to really transform things and to be disruptive in ways that you never thought prior to this conversation, right? So I love the idea of everything that you're saying, and I think that the challenge is, this is your opportunity to take the language that you've just learned and apply it, in addition to everything else that Denver Startup Week is offering. So it's good luck.
Yeah. Also, thank you for the speech. That was awesome. Just kind of like regarding stigmas, I feel like the fashion industry is more stigmatized than ever, as well as like there's more startup brands than ever, I feel like, and they all believe that they have this edge, whether it's like being like environmentally friendly or like having a different edge in the fashion world. Do you think that'll ever change, or kind of like what are your thoughts in terms of like starting out and like how to like try and break those stigmas, or if like people will always be like keen on the label names and how that might change?
Yeah, I hear in terms about the influencer culture and going after brands and so on and so forth. It's a juggernaut. It's a juggernaut. So I, again, would get, inspiration from Arturo Escobar and just break away and create other cultures. And, if there's like-minded people in the audience, and clearly there's already, different ideas popping up here. And just to keep talking about this with these, and what are these post-growth values? What would a new indices look like? That was measuring post-growth advances. Would it be measuring a reduction in new product development and an increase in resale? So we know that resale displaces new product production, because right now that's not happening. Right now, resale is an additional stream of income. It's not displacing new production. Is that something that could happen? Could there be a commitment from companies to do that? That's a relatively simple thing to do, you know. There are other things. We were talking last night about Patagonia, I think it was last year, with in New Zealand and Australia, and I don't know why globally, but why not globally? Instead of economies of scale, again, that language, scale, instead of giving discounts to people who order more goods, giving discounts to companies who become B corporations or prove that they've got reduced carbon emissions. That's, you know, that is a lever in the system. Someone else this morning talked about these levers in the system that you can make happen in your own company. It's just a little thing, but it's a little bit like the goodwill label. It's a little idea, but it's got this bigger ramification. Those, you know, and those are just a couple of ideas. But if you're brainstorming with someone, having coffee with someone, or you're at a conference like this, and we can chat afterwards, happy to, could talk about this a lot, dream about it, you know. So, you know, just keep brainstorming ideas and they'll come. They just do, you know. Yeah, you're welcome. Yes, another person in the front row that was smiling, thank you.
Well, I have to start by saying I came to this because of the kind of the economic aspect of it. My husband would tell you also, I have no fashion sense at all. He would say ad infinitum, but be that as it may, I guess, yeah. But I guess what I'm trying to figure out is the ask here is it to, well, you're asking the larger economy to stop thinking about growth at all costs. And so would you think of it like, okay, you can grow to a size where you're comfortable and you're doing something good and you're reusing this stuff and then just be satisfied there? You know, and I keep on thinking of these big companies you were talking about, the Irish company. And they're really good at this marketing of demand creation. It's a little John Kenneth Galbraith style economics. And it seems to me like what really has to scale and really grow to make an alternatives work is a kind of a massive marketing engine that promotes an alternative and just says, okay, well, maybe you don't really need to be that big. But that's kind of not the mentality of the startup week here. Everybody wants to be the next Google or of fashion or whatever else. So I don't know how we address that. So I'm not sure if I'm getting this across, but I'm just asking your opinion on it.
Yeah. No, you're definitely getting it across. And in startup culture, you've even got to have a plan for growth, right, to get an exit strategy in order to get the capital investment. And so it's pervasive. It's all the way through. So you said lots of things there. So things that limit. So I've got some ideas about what limits growth. I think the more examples there are of people choosing this path, the more it gets popularized, and the more then it gets absorbed. So that's number one. In terms of the scale, this is somewhat theoretical, right? But then you try and bridge the theory into practice. Is we really should be limited by the ecology's, the environment's ability and the capacity to support our production. And there are people probably working at that level. But being aware of that extraction happening at greater speeds and volumes than the Earth can, keep up with, clearly, the physics are not working. They won't work. So eventually it will undermine itself. I feel that companies should be restricted also by the ability to follow through on their own rhetoric. So their front-end marketing and their back-end real change need to be married together. And then as soon as a company is not able to do that, that is perhaps an indicator of the size that they should be when there's ecological intelligence throughout the company. So what I mean there is when a company's advertising one thing, but their production people are given the imperative to drive prices down somewhere else that conflicts with that mission, that's a sign that the communication in the company is too big. So, these are ideas that you bring to the surface. You're at the meetings with local politicians, or you're invited to the table to have, you keep bringing these ideas. And, over time, they populate. They do. Or, cell phones populate, organic cotton populated, reduced ecological impacts as a design strategy populated. But we have to keep populating with these post-growth ideas. Oh, well, and that too. What a great idea for graphic designers to attend to, a whole campaign, about post-growth. Fantastic idea. It's a really great pivot for design.
And if I could close on this, since we are now at a time, I do believe that most of these conversations are best had with a cocktail in a hand. So if any of you would like to have a cocktail at one point, here. And discuss this further, I would love that. I would love to learn from you and hear what you're doing and better understand. And I think Lynda said you were going to be buying the first round for everyone, so thank you for that.
I need one now.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, I deserve one now. Yeah.
But we've concluded this presentation, this session. Again, I hope that you were inspired to think differently. I hope you were a little bit pushed out of your comfort zone at some level. And thank you, Lynda. You're amazing.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.